Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for joining the Prince George's County Memorial Library System for this evening's live virtual event. My name is Nick Brown. I'm pleased to be your host tonight. Also have a special shout out for my colleague Karen Luoma from our Laurel branch who helped arrange this program. We appreciate her. We're very grateful to a guest speaker tonight whose name is Bear Afkhami. He is a frequent member of our Great Decision series at the Laurel branch, and we're really excited to have him presenting tonight on a topic that he is an expert on from his own discipline. Mr. Afkhami is a local citizen foreign policy advocate who's worked within the Homeland Security and emergency management fields for 10 years. He has written on intelligence issues as well as the histories of various wars and profiles of foreign terrorist organizations. He holds a degree in intelligence studies and currently serves as Director of Innovation and Development for a federal aviation contractor. We are really appreciative of Bears joining us this evening for this program, and we hope you all enjoy. If you are watching on Facebook, YouTube, or Periscope, please know that we're going to be monitoring all of the comment and posts associated on those platforms. So when we get to the Q&A portion and discussion portion, please know that we will be checking every different platform on which we are streaming tonight and sharing that with Bear. If you happen to have friends out there and would like to share this broadcast with them, feel free to share either the Crowdcast link or you can share directly on Facebook, YouTube, or Periscope, which is integrated with Twitter. And if you are excited to post on social media tonight, we ask that you use the hashtag LovePGCMLS, as it is Love Your Library Month here in Prince George's County. And we're so grateful to celebrate our entire community together through the library. So without further ado, welcome to Bear Afkhami.
Hey, good evening. Thanks, Nick. I know I see a lot of familiar names, so some of you were already acquainted. I approached the library system on, doing a presentation on the impact of COVID-19 on foreign policy, as we live in pretty interesting and unstable times, perhaps. So I thought it would be a good idea to try to tie in the COVID and foreign policy themes and have a discussion on what experts are potentially seeing that might happen as a result of this global pandemic, which we haven't seen before. What the format is basically going to be, I have a PowerPoint. I have embedded some videos in it. We are probably going to have a problem with the volume a little bit. So what is probably going to end up happening is I'm going to pause it a little bit, talk about the video, and continue. I also tried to include as many unclassified FBI and Homeland Security documents and reports as possible. So I wanted to put those in there as well. And of course, I consulted some of the most credible news sources out there to put this together. So without further ado, what I first want to talk about is what we know is going on, what the global impacts of COVID-19 currently are. And to most of you, none of this will sound surprising. Obviously, unemployment, every country is experiencing it if they had to go into a lockdown. The shrinking GDP, that's definitely an issue. The United States, China, and all the other countries. And historically speaking, some of these countries have never seen a shrinking GDP before. It's always been a growth. It may have not grown as much as they wanted or had been predicted, but there was always a positive growth. Obviously, because of the lockdowns, there's decreased trade. There's decreased immigration. There are more border controls, so not as much global trade is taking place. And that's also because the supply chain has been negatively impacted as well. And obviously what's going on right now is there's a big focus, a highlight on the weaknesses of our supply chains. And another highlight of lack of preparedness. A lot of people are asking, why didn't we see this coming? And of course, there's a highlight on national security issues and national security threats when it comes to a pandemic and its effects. And we're, highlighting those. We don't know fully what the future holds for those security threats, but we can name several. And what you'll see about what's going on with these known impacts is that they're kind of all interlinked. And as we go through the presentation, you'll see that these things that we know now contribute to most of the other after effects of what we might see with COVID. So let's talk about foreign policy realities before COVID-19. That's very important because we can assume that what we knew about the world and foreign policy before is just going to be something that we build on it. So obviously there was a growth of isolationist sentiments. This was in the U.S., the U.K. They wanted to exit the European Union. Even in France, Macron won a somewhat narrow victory. It was surprising that the right-wing parties did so well. The Philippines, Duterte is definitely taking some isolationist routes. Even with Germany, the opposition parties, and I could go on and name more countries, but Hungary was also another one. Another reality when it comes to foreign policy was also the China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I know that in the Great Decisions program, we've talked quite a lot about that, but that's basically China's global effort to influence other nations through economic means. And what they do is basically go into other countries, for those of you who are not aware, and they offer certain services and products and trade for future rights to, let's say, minerals, or future export or import rights, or the right of using their waterways for transportation, something like that. And then obviously we're seeing a lot of immigration issues, a lot of refugee issues, and a lot of climate change issues. Now, all those will basically be amplified because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some noteworthy regional power competitions before COVID-19. Turkey was asserting itself in the Middle East. Iran, obviously, Iran and Saudi Arabia, the major adversaries in the Middle East, fighting a lot of different proxy wars. There was also India and Pakistan, which saw some conflict, tensions rise several months ago. And again, we can assume that these regional power competitions will either remain or accelerate. And then there's the global power competition. So obviously we have the US, there's Russia, China, and EU as a whole entity to be worked on. So foreign policy realities during COVID-19. Some of the things we've seen recently, there's been a really big amplification of the blame game on the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. We'll actually go very much in depth on this blame game and, the alternate realities that different forces, different powers are trying to introduce and make that the narrative. We'll also talk about the reflection on security of supply chains that can have quite a lot of alarming impacts for the future, especially of foreign policy and global trade. And then globalism. One of the, whether you agree with it or not, globalism and the debate of globalism is going to get amplified because this is a global pandemic. So some will argue that if the world wasn't so globalized, perhaps the threat of a global pandemic would be less. Reexamination of the world order. One thing that we should clarify is, what is the world order? It's we often hear it in conspiracy theories, but world order basically, when it comes to foreign policy, is referencing the structures that we've built in the world to be able to communicate and resolve conflicts, perform all sorts of foreign policy aspects as a global world order of some type of organization. So the WHO is a perfect example of a world order organization. The United Nations, the Security Council, the State Department, any country's State Department, those types of organizations, World Trade Organization, all those, that's the world order, how we communicate with each other through diplomatic channels. And then, of course, the power competitions, the global power competitions, Russia, China, US, EU, those are also getting very amplified. And again, all these things are kind of intermingled together. Going over the relevant players that are going to get mentioned in this presentation quite a lot: China, for obvious reasons, Russia, United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and then, some of these world order organizations, the European Union, World Health Organization, United Nations, and the G7 specifically. And we'll talk about why G7 is mentioned specifically in a little bit down the road. So let's talk about the blame game. One of the big reasons the blame game has started is because China has started to offer alternate narratives on where the virus came from. And you see that Russia has also picked up on it, and some of their proxy nations have as well. So one of the debates now being had on the global stage is, where did the virus start? Now, we're not going to discuss the details on where the virus started, just offering what type of information that's out there. But, there are a few different ones, like obviously the wet markets at Wuhan, biological facility in Wuhan. That's another one which supposedly engineers, biochemicals for defense purposes. And obviously you may have heard that there are several conspiracy theories regarding the U.S. Army or U.S. Secret Services having, introduced the virus into the world. Another blame game and question that's out there is, when did China report human-to-human transmission? Now, the human-to-human transmission reporting is especially important because a lot of the countries that are impacted by this, particularly the United States, are making the accusation that China knew well before late December, when they actually reported human-to-human transmission. Well before that time, they knew that the virus was already going through human-to-human transmission. So obviously, the Chinese are attempting to dilute the origins and challenging the narrative of the U.S. And then there's a third issue when it comes to China and the blame game: is China basically reporting their death records in an accurate way? So there were recent discoveries that several thousand urns are being delivered to China. Only time will tell. Perhaps further detailed investigations, or we may never know what the accurate numbers are. So we're going to get into some of the videos. What I'd like to play for you, and fortunately this one is all in Russian, so if you don't hear it, it's okay. There are quite a lot of subtitles, which is important. But this is a video of Russian propaganda on the origins of the virus. And I'll start it from the beginning so you can read the initial subtitles. Now, this narrative is absolutely preposterous. It's equating the fact that Donald Trump, having been owned a pageant company and handing crowns to beauty queens, somehow relates to the coronavirus, which corona means crown. the Russians are masters of propaganda, and they have been for the last century. What this tactic is kind of a soft tactic to not necessarily go right into what is they're going to conclude as a logical conclusion, but they're kind of opening up the door between a connection between the coronavirus and America. Obviously, this is kind of outlandish and it's taken it a little bit too far, but they don't stop there. So this is a biochemical expert. So the poisoning of ex-KGB spies, obviously, the United States and the Western world acknowledges that Russia did that. In Russia, the propaganda says that the U.S. did that. And you saw that the quote-unquote expert, this is on a major news channel. It's not Russia's #1 news agency, but just by being able to say that I heard an expert say that I believe the United States' secret services are in charge of spreading this virus. And by the way, they did the same thing with swine flu, MERS, and all the other viruses. That's one of the tactics. And I'll let the video play a little bit because I think you'll enjoy the graphics and the crown.
Coronaviruses are a family of viruses that range from the common cold to MERS coronavirus, which is Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus, and SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus. Coronaviruses are circulating in animals, and some of these coronaviruses have the capability of transmitting between animals and humans. We call that a spillover event.
So some in response to this said, "Oh, obviously the news segment was a joke," but obviously this is, as you'll see, part of the larger narrative that's being offered. Let's talk about supply chains. So commodities, telecom equipment, pharma, and PPE. Those are the big things that we're concerned about right now. Some of them, like telecom equipment, the U.S. was concerned about before, but the Chinese, they're culturally, they're much more patient than many of the other cultures in the rest of the world, and that does translate to the way they view war. So one of the big power competitions with China and their desire to engage the world and impact things the way they want is to be in charge. And the Chinese have famous plans where they wanted to be, in charge of controlling the commodities of the world, the telecom equipment, the pharmaceuticals, which we're seeing now, is penicillin manufactured in the United States anymore? No. Where does it come from? Most of the materials most of the bio ingredients come from China, and obviously PPE. So you could argue that they really do have us in a bind if they didn't want to share the commodities or the pharmaceutical ingredients or the PPE that we needed. And that's one of the reasons why there is a shortage, is because they were using the PPE themselves, and they can choose to exercise limiting the export of PPE to certain countries. And that will actually come into play once we actually talk about some of the future impacts of the virus. So globalism, there are a lot of things that you're hearing in public on the news right now and articles, but globalism is under a bit of a microscope right now. You hear, globalism accelerated the virus spread, which, depending on how you want to, define globalism, could be true. We need to emphasize local resilience. Now, this is a very good point about local resilience, like cities and states being able to implement preparedness and not necessarily relying on a national scope. While it's a completely legitimate point to make, it does point away from globalism and having a global economy. And that will, people who are isolationists may use this as a a bargaining chip on their side of the debate. It's better to import less and export more. That was a debate we were having before this, and it's probably going to amplify. Immigration and open borders, there may be some element of truth to this. Obviously, if you have open borders, uncontrolled, you don't know necessarily what's coming into your border, but did it accelerate the virus? We don't know. And then globalization and world trade made our supply chains weaker. Again, there is a bit of truth to this, obviously, because we're so scattered now. But all these issues about globalism will impact foreign policy in the future. Some of the things that go into the global world order. So we talked about some of the organizations. The European Union is obviously one of the major organizations within the world order. And it's not just important for Europe, but it's also important for Central Asia and Russia, and those power dynamics. So one of the big things that happened early on when Italy's cases started to rise rapidly was that Italy asked for, Italy as a EU member, an active EU member, asked the EU, particularly France and Germany, and the Czech Republic, to lift certain restrictions on providing PPE to Italy. Unfortunately, France and Germany stepped in and said, no, we're not going to send you the PPE because we need them ourselves. And the EU as a whole failed, and this is an headline from a Reuters article, the EU failed to persuade France and Germany to lift coronavirus healthcare controls. That's actually pretty significant, because what happened after this, and we'll watch a video which explains this, but France and Germany denied Italy, their colleague in the EU, required very important PPE. What happened was Russia stepped in and went into Italy with not just biochemical trained soldiers, but also with aircraft full of PPE. And of course, a lot of people in Russia were questioning this because they said that they needed themselves, but Putin played the game quite well and took advantage of the chaos between France and Germany not providing that PPE to Italy. And now Russia has a presence in Italy, and that is very reflective of on the videos that we'll see in their narratives. The other thing I wanted to share with you is a quote from a Jordanian health official that's in charge of the response. The CDC in previous outbreaks was a fantastic source of information, she was saying. This time, for some reason, the messages out of the CDC were not as strong as they usually are. So this was on an NPR interview, and what the health minister was talking about was that instead of relying on the United States' CDC, they were now relying on the Chinese CDC, which is quite a big shift, especially in Jordan, because Jordan is very friendly, perhaps one of the most friendliest, the friendliest Middle Eastern nations to the United States. So it's going to have quite an impact when people turn into those institutions like the EU or the United States for help, but then Russia and China are coming in and filling that power vacuum and helping those countries. And then speaking of world order, you likely will not be able to hear this very well, but this is Trump's announcement of defunding or halting funding to the World Health Organization. Obviously, we're the largest contributor of funds to the WHO, and it's not the best time for this type of action because they're not just fighting COVID; they're fighting other types of infections around the world. This is putting them at a disadvantage. But basically, his point is that the WHO has been favoring China. We don't like what the steps that they took. It wasn't soon enough. It wasn't big enough, etc. But again, this as a world order organization, the United States withdrawing from this type of organization has very big impacts for the future of foreign policy. Because again, when we exit certain organizations, our seats are literally empty, which means we have no voice in those organizations. And when we have no voice, other narratives tend to become more prominent, and perhaps because they're able to, narrate, those narratives will become reality. Power competitions. Obviously, China was one of the big power players in the global order previous to this. And China is really, it seems like they're taking advantage. They're seeing COVID-19 as an opportunity to push the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party methods and ways. So they've, in China, there's been a documentary. This was reported on March 2nd by Foreign Policy Magazine. The multi-part series, it's called a Battle Against Epidemic, China Combating COVID-19 in 2020. And it highlights President Xi as a hero and really talks up the Chinese Communist Party's critical role in fighting the virus spread. And again, they talk about those basically the conspiracies that the Russians were talking about, how the U.S. Army was responsible for it, how this is a manufactured weapon of the United States, or perhaps for U.S. pharmaceutical companies to make more money. And they also deny that the virus originated in China. And, in the United States, we have a hard time believing that other countries will believe this. But if you're a proxy of China, like Iran, the supreme leader of Iran was about a month ago on TV saying that the virus didn't originate in China and in fact was manufactured by the U.S. Army. So because they have such a high and wide net around the world because of the Belt and Road Initiative and things like that, they are able to spread that narrative rather easily throughout the world. Talked about the Chinese thinking behind war. So war is just not one element. It's not just militaries fighting each other. It's control of economies. It's control of critical supply chains. And one of the other things that, and this is from a DHS intelligence article on April 14th, Chinese government almost certainly managing sister city relationships in the U.S. to advance national policies. The Chinese government has an organization called the Chinese Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries. And what that organization does is go around the world establishing sister city relationships. So, and I'm making this up since we're in Maryland, Baltimore and Shanghai might be sister cities. And they basically, do cultural exchanges and, things that you might not think are relevant. But through those cultural exchanges and parties and galas and information exchanges, they build relationships with the power players in those cities. So when the Chinese want to push out certain information, they might actually, have more ease in approaching those mayors or county executives or city council members and kind of help amplify those narratives a little bit. So this is a Washington, a New York Times video that was done. It's very good. We'll try to post this link so you can actually fully watch it. Again, we might have some audio problems.
The Chinese government has one of the most extensive propaganda networks in the world inside the country, but it also aggressively works to influence how it's perceived outside its borders. China has invested billions into bolstering its image. Split-run news outlets push out messages in English. And its diplomats have flocked to Twitter in the last year. But what happens when this massive PR apparatus has to do major damage control? We analyzed thousands of tweets from state media and official accounts and found three dominant messages China wants to project to the world. Here's what we learned. A novel coronavirus hit the Chinese city of Wuhan in January. Early whistleblowers were silenced. People were angry about a government cover-up. But in the majority of tweets we analyzed, state-owned publications pushed a much more optimistic view, promoting what they said was an effective response. They are sharing videos like this. The Chinese Communist Party refers to this as positive energy, only focusing on the bright side of an issue. China did take drastic measures to try and stem the outbreak, but that's the only story China to run praise from foreign experts of China's successes.
It's a remarkable response that's being organised in China to contain the virus.
One tweet from state media that did reveal Chinese citizens' discontent, it was quickly deleted. Once the virus spread across the world, China started positioning itself as being at the forefront of fighting the pandemic. It presented itself as a partner, a grateful recipient, and more recently, a selfless leader, highlighting large donations from Chinese companies and the government. China hasn't typically disparaged other countries' responses to the virus, with one exception, the United States.
President Donald Trump has been accused of denying the downturn and outright rejecting the concerns over the COVID-19 outbreak.
Another thing we noticed are Chinese outlets disputing the origin of the virus. It all started in late February with a renowned Chinese epidemiologist. Around the same time, the CDC reported the first case in the United States with an unknown origin. A screenshot of the announcement, incorrectly translated in Chinese, began to trend online, and was untouched by Chinese government censors. And a high-ranking government spokesperson actively pushed disinformation about where the virus came from.
目前病毒溯源工作仍在进行中，尚无定论。
A government giving an optimistic spin to bad news is not unique.
We want to go big or silent. The country is very.
So that, that's kind of a summary of what we were talking about, of what narrative their Chinese Communist Party is pushing. Basically optimism, followed by providing PPE to as many countries as possible to kind of, again, push that narrative that the Chinese authoritarian system is the type of system that can actually respond to this type of crisis, global crisis. And then obviously you see that the Chinese are, creating questions about the origins. They're not providing alternatives necessarily. Sometimes they are, but it's enough on the world stage to say, hey, we should slow down and think about where this virus actually came from. And that time provides different parties to come up with alternatives, basically. And Russia is very good at doing that in this done that quite extensively. Speaking of Russia, again, reiteration of things we've talked about already, but there's a headline, Wall Street Journal, virus politic at play at Moscow sends soldiers to help Italy. Russia's presence in aircraft full of medical supplies to Italy to aid combating the coronavirus when help from Europe and the U.S. is scarce. Now, that's Wall Street Journal, and they are correct. The U.S. is not assisting Italy directly, and the EU, not Europe as a whole, but France and Germany did not, were unwilling to export PPE to one of their sister EU nations. A DHS counterintelligence report stated that Russian intelligence services are likely watching the U.S. response to COVID-19 pandemic, at least concerning healthcare supply chain shortfalls and the public's reaction to disinformation. And I was actually going through some FBI intelligence reports and DHS as well, and I was making a list of the different disinformation campaigns that the FBI is highlighting and the different hackings that they're highlighting, even on our healthcare facilities. And I decided to stop because they're too numerous. And I just didn't have enough space on this presentation to put them, so I stopped. But that's something that they're pushing quite heavily. There's another DHS economic security report that asserted that Russia is intentionally trying to reduce oil prices by maintaining artificially high production. I'm sure you've read in the news that the price of crude oil hit zero and then went negative. So it's basically worthless right now. And that's the reason behind that is we have way more supply than there is demand right now. Basically the producers have nowhere to take this oil because we're not driving, we're not using, our factories aren't working. And Russia is taking advantage of that and, maintaining high production levels, even when there are, the excess oil is just incredible right now. And then I mentioned this already, increased cyber attacks from Russian state and non-state actors. It seems like one of the, and we know that the Chinese are constantly involved in hacking operations. It seems like the Russians have stepped it up a little bit more, and they're a little bit more apparent about it, especially their disinformation campaigns. But Russia on the world stage is not, and before COVID-19, was not happy with the status quo. China was a little bit more happy with the status quo because they were doing very well. So you see that playing out a little bit. Russia wants to kind of blow things up a little bit. China just wants to assert themselves and kind of maintain the way things are. They don't want to have countries like the United States start to take their supply chains out of China. So this video is basically about the power competition of Russia. And basically what we're talking about here is Russia going to Italy. And believe it or not, Russia and China were not the only countries sending aid and personnel, doctors to Italy. Cuba was also sending aid and personnel to Italy. Again, that's a nation allied with Russia historically, friendly to China, going into the European Union and fulfilling a need for PPE and medical supplies and medical professionals. It's relevant because there's a gap, there's a power vacuum that's being filled by entities outside of the Western world order. And again, Italy was not the only recipient of Russia's aid. The United States actually received PPE.
Accepting it was a very nice offer from President Putin. I spoke to him the other night, as I told you, and they had excess medical equipment, things, and I'll take it. I think it's very.
So it's highly doubtful that Russia has excess PPE to fight a global pandemic. Their numbers that are being reported are highly disputable. However, they did it. We paid for it, from what I understand, which is fine. But the optics of the situation are really bad, because this is the most powerful nation in the world, who has historically been a leader in these times of crisis, accepting aid from an adversary who is engaged in opportunism and power competition. And I don't want to play out these videos throughout, because you might have trouble hearing with the volume. So what has the United States done? The only thing that really the United States had done, Mike Pompeo announced, and this is before we pulled out of the WHO and accepted aid from different countries. So we promised $274 million in emergency health and humanitarian funding, and it went to different UN organizations. No one is going to remember this when, days later, the President Trump removed funding from the World Health Organization. That's what people are going to remember. That's what's going to be reflected in future, narratives, and basically what people are going to remember when the different foreign policy, the diplomats are talking. Another organization that's relevant to the world order, the G7, which used to be the G8. Without Russia, it's the G7. The U.S. to include Wuhan virus language in G7 joint statement fractures alliance. So basically, the G7 virtually met, and the U.S. insisted that the virus, instead of COVID-19, be called the Wuhan virus, or instead of SARS-CoV-2, be called Wuhan virus. For several different reasons, the rest of the G7 nations didn't want to go with that. And what happened was they issued separate statements instead of a joint statement, which is not a good time. It may seem trivial, saying, okay, well, different countries made separate statements. That's very unusual in times of crisis, especially, not necessarily war, but during times of crisis like this, when typically you see diplomats and foreign policy members uniting and showing a united face in the face of, crisis. What we're having is, again, another fracture, and that fracture is very important, again, in the future of foreign policy and how the virus will be impacted. And then to top that off, this is, again, you may have heard about this. So there are several countries, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, South Africa, Malaysia, several countries that basically came together and said, we're gonna share technology, we're gonna share our resources, we're going to try to accelerate the development of a virus, and we're also going to make it available to everyone, whether regardless of income, or the developing nations, whether they have access to it or not. The notable absence in this was the United States. And that's, again, not good, because we obviously withdrew funding. We're not participating in WHO activities. Our seats were empty. We didn't have a voice in this. And again, the narrative is going to be determined by others. And narratives are extremely important when it comes to foreign policy. I will also note that China was not part of this group as well. So they're going another route as well. Now, there's nothing to say that the United States, if we develop a vaccine, the government won't share it. But again, narratives and optics are quite important when it comes to foreign policy and diplomacy. So let's talk about some expert predictions or potential of things to happen as experts see it. Foreign policy realities after COVID-19. China will likely continue or escalate its Belt and Road Initiative, which we talked about, and attempt to control the COVID-19 narrative. That's almost 100% given. They'll attempt to export the CCP. Now, that's not just because of COVID-19. The authoritarian regime it's always been a part of their plan to export their type of government to other countries, not necessarily through invasion, but other means like economic means. They're going to maintain their espionage and cyber attacks. That actually will come into play a little bit more. Russia will seize the opportunity to expand its footprint in more Middle Eastern, European, and South American governments. Obviously, they've already started doing that. Italy, not just a member of the EU, but also a member of NATO, where there are American bases and troops stationed actively. It's quite a feat to accomplish. Take advantage of this opportunity to go in and establish somewhat of a foothold in a European nation that's a NATO member and an EU member. So they'll continue to try to take advantage of this by offering their assistance, by offering their PPE. And the U.S. may continue to withdraw from global organizations and agreements. Now, obviously, this wasn't something that just started with COVID-19. This administration withdrew from climate change accords. They exited some humanitarian organizations in the United Nations. Obviously, there's no hiding that this president and administration follows a bit more of an isolationist sentiment, and that's really the route they're going to. Given all that, it's very likely, the WHO defunding is not all that surprising given their track record of not wanting to be part of those global world order organizations. France, Germany, and the UK will likely attempt to fill the diplomatic power vacuum created by US absences. This will be a natural thing for them to do since they're kind of, Germany, France, and the UK are very large economies. Historically and traditionally, they've had quite a lot of soft diplomatic power. So they will attempt to basically fill those voids. And a lot of that was already evident before COVID-19 when the EU decided that they were going to try to, because of the trade disputes between Trump and the EU and the tariffs, they were going to try to go around the US a little bit. Propaganda wars will continue around the origins of COVID-19, and China's reporting accuracy and timelines. That's almost 100% certainty that it'll happen. As many nations, including the US, seek to diversify supply chains, including manufacturing at home, China will feel further economic pressure. Now, that's very important because if the isolationist sentiment, anti-globalist sentiment continues to grow, and that reflects in elections, you can see real pressure on China and its economy. If all of a sudden we decide that we're going to manufacture all our medicines in the United States, or at least in the United States and Canada and Europe, that'll have a significant impact on China and the way they do business. And that economic pressure, that type of economic pressure eventually may build up to some type of retaliation. Now, it could be economic retaliation, with further import-export tariffs. It could be more cyber attacks, state and non-state actors, or some experts are not completely discounting the possibility of conventional methods of challenging other powers. So we're talking about conventional war, basically. And some experts will note the presence of our aircraft carriers and how COVID-19 could potentially weaken our aircraft carrier responses, whereas China's aircraft still operating in the Pacific. So although the school of thought right now is that it's an extremely low possibility, depending on how things build up, how much pressure there is around the world, we don't know what we're going to see, basically. So I want to end there. And as we normally do with great decisions, we have some great discussion questions. And then before we do the discussions questions, what I'd just like to ask is if you have any questions before we start those, we can talk about any questions you have. And I do see a comment from Ambra. Cannot hear the video clip. I apologize. We kind of knew that was going to be an issue. What we're going to do is make the links available to you so you can watch them after.
So folks, if you have questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box and we'll share them with Bear. We're not able to bring you on screen on this platform because it's a broadcast platform. So we'll just share whatever you type into the chat box with Bear. The first question is from Jane. You might have covered it already. Is that like how some countries called it ISIL and the US calls it ISIS?
It's probably a little bit more extensive than that. The debate between ISIL, and ISIS originated with the organization Daesh, which was basically translated into ISIL, Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. When they changed their name, they rebranded. They went to ISIS and then they went to IS. Certain diplomats in France and overwhelmingly in the EU actually changed and went to whatever that organization was calling themselves. The United States decided to go another route. That is somewhat of controlling a narrative, and you do see that is a good example of how we do that with foreign policy. But I would say this narrative and the origins is probably it's quite larger of an issue because it covers the origins, it covers the response, it covers accuracy of data reporting, and then really what all those alternatives turn into, depending on where you are in the world, are different realities, really.
Great, thank you. If anyone else has questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll share those with Bear. And likewise, if you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or Periscope, feel free to type in a comment on those platforms and we can share those with Bear as well.
And I guess our discussions questions, we can't really get a lot of feedback. Can we share, Nick, can we share audio, or it's both audio and video?
So this is just restricted to who's presenting.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the discussion questions that you should consider is, taking a look at the information that's available out there and kind of decide where you believe the virus came from and how it originated, and take it, just consider what alternatives you're hearing and how you would kind of weigh the different facts and figures to arrive at a conclusion. I see there are two other questions, Nick. What is the likelihood of the U.S. and other major countries revitalizing their manufacturing industries after COVID? That's actually that was one of the discussion questions we were going to talk about, but it's very likely. I think there's already talk and there's real danger, as we see with our supply chains. Basically having no plan B. There's no backup. If we're not getting PPE from the 3M factories in China, we're not getting them. So one, obviously we're going to re-examine for the future our stockpiles for times of crisis like this, and very likely the lesson learned from this round of the pandemic is going to be that we need more of those stockpiles. But considering the isolationist sentiments, the very reality that we should probably have some of those critical supply chains within our own borders, not necessarily all of it, it's very likely that those actions will have to take place. I see a question from Amra. So do you see policy changing if the present administration changes? In general, yes. Assuming the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party right now is Joe Biden. Historically, Joe Biden has really embraced globalism, global trade, and international pacts. So obviously he was part of he was vice president with the JCPOA, the deal that was reached with Iran, and the P5 to limit Iranian nuclear weapons. Obviously, Trump withdrew from that. Considering that the climate change accord that was signed again when he was vice president, it's very likely that he's way more open to these types of global world order organizations. So, very likely that if the administration changes and he is the president, we will see some walkbacks of these different types of isolationist tendencies that this administration has. It takes about 2 to 3 years to start manufacturing since we do not have manufacturing plants ready to go. That's absolutely correct. My guess is that if that type of action, and I don't know how deep it'll go as far as manufacturing at home, but the defense authorization executive powers that the president has, those are likely going to stick around for a while. When we try to reorganize, what we should manufacture at home, what we should. There are a lot of plants like the GE plants, GM and all the other manufacturers that have kind of reshaped their manufacturing facilities to, let's say, produce ventilators. Some of that may stick around for a while, as you see a lot of times during times of crisis, like after 9/11, we passed a lot of laws that were meant to somewhat be temporary, but you see them that not just in the United States, but they've kind of stayed around. So that might be something that we see sticking around. There's another question. Do you see immigration policy changing after COVID? That's definitely, I don't know how it'll change, but obviously it's going to bolster some of the isolationist, closed border sentiments that are around today. And there's definitely going to be a debate about that immigration debate. The refugee debate was around already, but this is going to get amplified with the anti-globalism tendencies. So we don't know how it's going to change, but it's not just going to be in the U.S. The debate is going to be had all around the world, even China and Russia's borders right now. There are reports that a lot of the new COVID cases in China are actually coming from the border between China and Russia. And I'll go on to some of the other discussion questions. So, why do you think there are so many theories as to the origins of the virus? That really is a good question for the way you perceive and understand foreign policy. What is the advantage of different countries? What's the benefit? What's the purpose of different countries offering different narratives? And basically what it comes back to is, their control and their self-interest and control of resources. So this question was already asked, but do you believe the U.S. should diversify its pharma and PPE supply away from China? And then where should this manufacturing take place? Now, it's almost certain that if we are manufacturing at home, there is going to be an increased cost. But really the debate is going to be, and it's going to have severe impacts on foreign policy, are those costs okay? Are we going to remember this crisis and say we're willing to pay more for a mask, or will we forget after 10 years and go back to the cost savings model? And then finally, final question that I had as far as discussion was, should the U.S. restore funding to the WHO and why? And um, the obviously that debate is going to take place within this administration and others, but it's not just the WHO. It's kind of a pattern, as we've discussed, and that pattern, if it keeps on going the way it goes, if we take more isolationist actions in the world, then the seats that we're not filling in those organizations are going to be filled by someone else. And down the road, we may not like the narratives that those the people offering. We may not like those narratives, the alternatives. So, when you think about whether we should re-engage with the WHO or the climate change accord, you really have to think down the road and think how it'll impact the global world order, and how it's not just today, but a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 30 years from now, what those effects are going to be. Nick, I'm not seeing any more questions unless you are.
Nope, I don't see any on my end. There's nothing on Facebook or YouTube. So last call, folks, on questions for Bear. Thanks so much for your patience with the audio on the clips. We'll share the links to the presentation as soon as we possibly can. We've got everyone's emails here in Crowdcast that we can send that link to you. And Bear, how can folks learn more about this topic through the library?
So one way is to, and I don't know if you can sign up for it now, but be on the lookout with the library. The Great Decisions program discusses different foreign policy issues. The season for Great Decisions has ended as of last week, but it's something that repeats every week. The library hosts it. There's a short video, and then there's a booklet and discussion questions. And there's a back and forth, good engagement. I'm sure the Foreign Policy Association, who puts that program on, will cover impacts of COVID on global foreign policy. And once they produce their programs, they'll have more information. It'll probably be 6 months down the road. So that's probably the best way to engage through the library. And obviously the library has quite an extensive collection of foreign policy material, ebook, audio, and physical books.
Awesome, thank you. So if anyone does not have a PGC MLS library card yet, we invite you to register for one at pgcmls.info. We are totally open for free virtual card signups right now, and there is no ID check required to get that virtual library card, and anyone who lives in the DMV area is eligible to get a virtual card through us. And I'll share the direct link here in 1 second for you. And also, if anyone has students in their lives who are Prince George's County Public School students, their link card number, which is their student ID, that number actually gets them access into all the library's resources, so a separate library card isn't needed. Looks like we have one new question. I don't know if this was covered already, but which theory on the origin of the virus do you find the most compelling? From Martin.
Looking at the evidence, it's not, and given the history, you have the MERS, which originated in the Middle East. You've had SARS, the first one, now SARS-2. There are coronaviruses all out there. One of the reasons the Asian countries are better suited to address pandemics is a lot of the coronaviruses do originate. I'm the type of person, unless I see the actual evidence of, some type of foul play, whether the Chinese imported the coronavirus or COVID-19 to the United States, or whether it was made at their, defense biochemical facility, I tend to go with the most likely explanation, which is, coronaviruses live in animals, and there is animal to human transmission. So that's the most likely explanation, unless you hear, or you see actual evidence that'll say something to the contrary. There was a comment from Amra. The plants in China are automated to bring. The plants in China are automated and bring that time of technology might take it longer and expensive. Will drug prices go up? It's reasonable to conclude that if our supply chains are moved to the countries where it costs more to make those drugs, then it's likely that the drug prices will go up. And there was a follow-up question: would higher costs be supplemented by the government? Probably not. That's definitely a debate for the political candidates and the way we vote to consider that. There was also another comment, a very true comment by Amra: infectious agents have no boundaries. That's absolutely true, and we should definitely keep that in mind.
Great. Then Jane said, wouldn't the higher cost be supplemented by the government?
Perhaps. We'll find out, I guess.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Glad Bear had a chance to answer your questions, and thank you so much for sharing those questions. Oh, we got one more new one from Frederica, and she asked, do you think that China's rapid movement in Africa will affect more intelligent and respectful American foreign policy?
I assume so. China's rapid movement in Africa is not something new, and it's taken probably the last 15, 20 years, multiple administrations. The problem with American foreign policy, and perhaps a lot of other countries' foreign policy, is that it's extremely short-sighted. So often when we make those decisions, they're made from the executive branch. Then the executive branch has a short shelf life. And typically, especially the last 20, 30 years, you see the diminishing role of Congress when it comes to foreign policy. If congressional actions get involved a little bit more with foreign policy, those types of decisions, especially like confronting China's rapid growth in Africa and South America, we may see a little bit more strategic thinking and thought. So we actually start planning for like 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And because that's exactly what the Chinese are doing. The Chinese, if you look at them in the 70s, when we opened relations with them, open trade, they were not a wealthy nation. There was very little development, but they have the foresight and the strategic thinking and the patience to play the long game, basically. And I think a lot of foreign policy decisions that are made in the U.S. are not necessarily strategic and for the long haul.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, we'll let Bear get back to his evening now. We really appreciate everything, and thanks all for the really great questions. Be sure to visit pgcmls.info/virtual-events, and you can check out our full lineup of upcoming programs. And we appreciate all of you. See you again soon.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.